Good day. We had an uncertain start to 2024, but recently, developments have been somewhat more positive. Inflation outcomes were worse than expected early in the year, leading to a repricing of rate expectations. There is still considerable uncertainty about the longer-run inflation outlook globally. That said, inflation outcomes in the United States have been more benign recently, and markets still see some room for adjustments by the US Federal Reserve this year. We may also see easing by other major central banks. Meanwhile, oil prices are back to where they were at the start of the year, at close to $80 per barrel after briefly exceeding $90 per barrel. Although geopolitical tensions are far from resolved, some of the more adverse economic scenarios, such as oil prices above $100 per barrel, appear less probable now. Our own forecast suggests that oil prices will remain near their current levels. The exchange rate of the rand has been particularly volatile since the previous MPC. It briefly appreciated to a 10-month high against the dollar last week. The starting point for our forecast is 18 rands 57 cents. Markets remain focused on the direction of domestic policy, a theme that has dominated many investor conversations over the past few months. As we speak, uncertainty remains elevated, but we expect greater clarity in due course. Turning to the outlook, we now see inflation stabilizing at our 4.5% objective in the second quarter of next year. This is an improvement on our March forecast, which only reached this milestone at the end of 2025. The changes to the outlook, however, are not large when compared to our March forecast. Average headline inflation for 2025 is only 0.1 percentage point lower. Clearly, the task of achieving our inflation objective is not yet done. The change in our inflation forecast mostly reflects recent data outcomes, with CPI releases for March and April turning out slightly better than expected. We have revised down our 2024 food and core forecasts marginally. Fuel price inflation is now expected to be higher in the near term, but it improves for 2025. This helps our forecast get to the target midpoint sooner. Nonetheless, the committee remains concerned that inflation expectations are elevated. After 3 years of inflation being above the midpoint, few survey respondents, especially from businesses and trade unions, believe that inflation will be at 4.5% in 2 years' time. Although the MPC assesses the risks to the inflation forecast to be broadly balanced at present, high inflation expectations require that we deliver on our target sooner rather than later to re-anchor expectations. Turning to the growth outlook, economic activity indicators for the first quarter have been coming in worse than expected, despite reduced electricity load shedding. However, these higher frequency data can be volatile. We expect slightly weaker growth in the first quarter, but This will be offset by better second quarter growth. We still forecast GDP growth of 1.2% this year. The growth numbers for the outer years also remain unchanged. We assess the risks to the growth outlook as balanced. The recent improvements in the power supply, with no load shedding since 26th March, is a welcome development. We have revised our load shedding assumption down, but additional revisions may be required if this performance is sustained. Overall, our forecasts show a modest acceleration in growth over the next few years, alongside a gradual stabilization of inflation at our target. However, uncertainty is unusually elevated at the moment. Considering this outlook, the MPC decided to keep the repo rate unchanged at 8.25%. The decision was unanimous. The forecast continues to see policy normalization, with rates easing into more neutral territory by next year. As before, the rate path from the quarterly projection model remains a broad policy guide, changing from meeting to meeting. Decisions of the committee will continue to be data dependent and sensitive to the balance of risks to the outlook. The MPC remains committed to stabilizing inflation at the midpoint of the target band. Achieving this outcome will improve the economic outlook and reduce borrowing costs. Finally, we reiterate the views of the committee on additional measures that would improve economic conditions. These include reaching a prudent public debt level, improving the functioning of network industries, lowering administered price inflation, and keeping real wage growth in line with productivity gains. This concludes our statement, and we would then take questions. And as usual, please identify yourself and the media house that you represent, and we would then deal with your questions. Kopan.
Good afternoon, Governor and Deputy Governors. Kopan Ogumbi from Reuters. A few questions, not as many as usual, I promise. In the statement you say you see inflation stabilizing back at the midpoint in the middle of next year, which is a positive revision from the previous meeting. So does this mean that there is room to be less restrictive sooner rather than later? But then also in the statement you say conditions remain uncertain. And is the clarity on this uncertainty related to the election outcome? Do you anticipate any market volatility given the most recent vote count? And then lastly, even though the BHP walked away from the Anglo deal, Anglo are talking of spinning off some of their South African assets. Do you see any risk of outflows? Did the SARB do any estimates related to this? And what impact a spin-off could have? Thank you.
I don't know, either your microphone, they switched it off.
Okay, let me try again. Okay, that's better. Good afternoon, Governor. Balesa Mfukeng from CNBC Africa. I have two questions for you. Governor, I'm sure you have been, enjoying the uninterrupted power supply for 2 months now. In fact, I believe all of us are. We've had uninterrupted power for 64 days now. Do you if this was to be maintained, but how much do you see it adding to the GDP growth of the country for the rest of 2024 and going into 2025? And my second question to you is, given the country's weak fundamentals and the probability that yesterday's elections may impact fiscal policy, do you see a case for monetary policy taking the burden of supporting economic growth while politicians find their feet? Thanks.
One more.
Good afternoon, Governor. It's Ntando Tukwana at Bloomberg News.
The name again?
Ntando Tukwana, Bloomberg News. Governor, in your statement, you say that the MPC assesses inflation forecast risks to be broadly balanced, and you're also saying that you see inflation still elevated. I'm just wondering, where are the other risks coming from, and also to what extent are the current political uncertainties that we are seeing affecting South Africa's risk premium? And then my second question is around GFECRA. At the last meeting, I asked whether the funds had been transferred to Treasury, and at that time the bill wasn't passed yet, but it has been. And we'd just like an update on whether those funds have been transferred and where we are in that process. Thank you.
That's it? Yeah, okay. Kapano, the inflation outlook that we have is susceptible to the risks identified. In previous meetings, we assessed the risks to be on the upside. And in this meeting, we think that they are broadly balanced. And the risks are still the same risks as in the previous meeting. We highlighted the risks with respect to oil prices, and we said that those risks could move in either direction. And in the previous meeting, our views were that the risks were still on the upside on the oil price. And indeed, we revised our oil price assumption marginally higher. But geopolitical tensions are still there. And they can tilt the price higher. But if things do not change for the worse, the oil price might remain stable or even decline. And so we can't make a call in which direction it would go, which is why we say it is balanced. We identified the risk with respect to food prices. And what we had seen had been that whilst the food price inflation has declined, and has declined faster than we had thought, the risk of El Nino are still there. It's too early to make the call on El Nino because, as we had said, it would lead to drought here and affect our crop, and the main impact might come through the maize and grain prices. But you have got massive rains in Latin America at the moment, which could mean that if the impact of El Nino comes, it might end up coming mainly via the exchange rate because you would still be able to access the grain. But that would in the main be with respect to yellow maize in the main because it is generally available, whereas we consume white maize. Our own production of white maize does not seem to be far from our demand, so we might be able to handle that. The problem is we are in the neighborhood, and the whole neighborhood consumes white maize. And so you can't analyze this just at looking at South African demand and production. You will also have to analyze what the impact of demand and production is on the entire region because it would affect the prices. When there is a shortage in the region, the pricing switches to import parity pricing, and that could set in. We had highlighted the risks with respect to the exchange rate, and we say that the exchange rate had been volatile. If this MPC had to pronounce on Monday, we would have probably said that the rand has done so well so far. It's Thursday now. Things had changed from what they were last week. And that's because there are so many moving parts. Firstly, on the global side, that global conditions looks like they would remain tighter for long. And if they remain tighter for long, it could impact capital flows to emerging market countries, including South Africa. But we had previously also stated that there is this synchronized, tighter global financial conditions. But as we highlight in the statement, there is a possibility that there could start to be divergence between the developed countries, with some holding and some loosening. And that means that assessing the impact of those global financial conditions on capital flows to a country like South Africa is not as clear-cut as it was before. And with that, it has got implications for the future developments of the exchange rate. So the exchange rate could move in either of the directions. So the risks are moving in different directions, and we think that at the moment they are actually balancing each other. And lastly, this is the year of great elections. And there are elections everywhere, and they have led to uncertainty, not just about the political trajectory, it's political leaders who determine policy, but also about what is the future evolution of policy. Is the world going to be more protectionist? Is the world going to experience more geo-economic fragmentation? All of those lead to uncertainty, and we have got to be cognizant and alive to those, and they are difficult for us to call. And so we assessed the risk thus to be balanced. And in our own case, I mean, you chaps have been working on all sorts of things about what's going to be happening. There is this poll, this shows this. There is this poll that shows this. At the moment, there is only one poll that matters, is the one that took place yesterday. And if you wait until the counting is done, your uncertainty might be removed. The BHP Anglo thing, maybe we deal with that later, but it's the other chaps have walked away, they might come back, we don't know what's happening, right? But we'll come back to that at the end of this thing. Palesa, load shedding impact, we had assessed this in the past. So as of January last year, we thought that the impact would be like almost 2%. And as the year was progressing, we were bringing that down. And even in this year, we brought it down. As we stated, that we have had no load shedding from the 26th of March to date. And if that is sustained, it might have different outcomes. Now, you would want to know the impact. As it stands, we estimate that the impact of load shedding will be 0.5% on growth this year. We have got growth of 1.2% forecast for this year. If our forecast is correct of 1.2%, it would mean that if the load shedding was according to the assumptions of the Reserve Bank, which is consistent with the base case of Eskom, growth would have been 0.5% more, meaning we would have had growth of some 1.7%, other things being equal. So at the moment, we can't say to you that if the load shedding is sustained, growth will be so much. All that we can do is to impute from what load shedding was deducting and whether as it is disappearing, how much of that fits into future growth. Bear in mind that the impact of load shedding was not just about load shedding itself. What we had attempted to calculate was load shedding, you have no electricity, this is what it means. But it also fits itself through sentiment. And if the current trajectory continues, it might impact positively on sentiment, both investor sentiment and consumer sentiment, and it might change the trajectory of many a forecast that we had seen. I'm not sure who the Minister of Finance is going to be after the elections or after the government has been formed, because the elections have taken place. And if you want to know what is going to happen to fiscal policy, that is the guy to appropriately direct the question to. The second part of your question is whether a future fiscal policy would put the burden on monetary policy to do the weight lifting. Well, economists complicate this. When you are faced with a situation where monetary policy has to do the weight lifting to try and support growth and either in the process keep its eye off inflation and generate inflation surprises, economists call that fiscal dominance. And if we were to enter the era of fiscal dominance, the only protection you have against fiscal dominance is an independent central bank with a clear mandate, a clear policy anchor, and with a track record of executing that mandate and pursuing that anchor. And in South Africa, you have such. So if fiscal policy falls in a direction that could undermine macroeconomic stability, it would mean that monetary policy has to do the heavy lifting to deal with inflation, because that is the mandate of the central bank. And if you had been checking what has been happening to your income, you would actually realize that your income is buying less because inflation is higher than what it used to be. And so, to protect your income, the central bank must rein in inflation. And that you have our commitment. We will rein in inflation, and we do not believe our policy objective of reining inflation to the midpoint of the inflation target range is done. Ntando, you raised the issue of the inflation and the risk balance. It was very much related to what Kopano said. I have dealt with those risks. But you also brought the issue of the risk, the country risk premium. Since the previous meeting, the country risk premium has been coming down. But it is still higher than equilibrium. And it is, for many instances, higher than those of our peers. A key driver of the country risk premium is actually the trajectory of fiscal policy, and thus relates to the question that Palesa has raised about what do we think would happen with fiscal policy. We will know once the government is formed what the fiscal policy of the new government is. G. FECRA. Flow of funds, we said the legislation had been passed. The Treasury and the Reserve Bank must agree the flows. The money will not flow in one big scoop, even for the year. It's expected that this year the amount that would be transferred, which will be the largest, would be 100 billion. We will have to agree with the Treasury the schedule, And the schedule will depend, one, on the Treasury's own needs of funds during the fiscal year, two, on the impact of the drawdown on domestic monetary conditions, so that we are synchronized and the drawdown does not have adverse impact on domestic financial conditions and thus impact on the monetary policy stance indirectly. Any other questions? Hillary. Oh, Alistair, you have the microphone, that's fine. Majans, you switched off the microphone. Oh, they say it's fine. They say it's fine.
Okay, then, so my question is to come back to the slight change in the statement. I mean, it reads quite dovish. You've moved from the balance assessment of inflation risks. Should we take from that? Thank you. So to repeat, you've moderated your language around the balance of risks, and you're kind of balanced on your inflation risks. Should we take a dovish signal from that? Are you closer to talking about and considering rate cuts now than you were in March? And did a discussion about rate cuts take place in this meeting? That's my question.
Hillary, that side.
Thanks, Governor. Hilary Joffe from Business Day. Governor, you've made it clear quite repeatedly that you would like to see South Africa's inflation target lowered to make the country more competitive and so on. I wondered, would you support more of a public consultation process, say, launched by yourselves and the Treasury, on whether we should be lowering the inflation target? And I ask it partly because lately you've been putting quite a lot of evidence into the public domain on the advantages, if you like, of doing it sooner rather than later. So a public consultation process, a document for public comment, is that an option? Is that something that would be a good idea? Second question, which is not strictly monetary policy, but maybe. Later this year, the two-pot retirement system change comes into effect. And I don't know if I'm correct that at that point, in quite a short time, a lot of money flows into the economy as some pension fund members, provident fund members, draw down on their savings. Do you have any estimate on how much those flows could be? And does it have any concerns for financial stability or monetary policy?
Zianda? Lizel, is there somebody at the back? Zianda might need a microphone. Oh, she has one.
I do, thanks, Governor. Governor, the first question came from YouTube. It's adding to Hillary's question on the inflation target. They're asking for an update on the revision of the inflation target. Then the second question, Governor, is from Siphelele Dludla at Business Report. Interest rates have been left at 8.25 for a year now, since the MPC meeting in May 2023. But inflation has failed to decline by 1 percentage point as it remains above 5%. Does the governor believe the SARB monetary policy decisions are having any impact in taming inflation, and how? Thank you, Governor. Those are all the questions for now.
Okay. This is, let's start with the last one because it is more interesting than the others. Spelele, inflation had failed to decline. That's a very interesting observation because you see inflation peaked in 2022 at 7.8%. The most recent reading is 5.2. The difference between 7.8 and 5.2 is not small at all. So if you wanted to know what monetary policy works, you better look at that because you will see the trajectory. It might be above 5%, but the monetary policy stance is working, because otherwise inflation wouldn't have declined. Granted, there might be other things that helped to drive the inflation down, but without the monetary policy stance, inflation would have continued to climb. So I guess that that answers your question. Don't pick up one point in 2023. We started to hike rates in 2021. And of course, we could have decided to do everything at once, and then you will not ask us the question anymore. But that's not how policy is executed. You take steps and you continuously evaluate the effectiveness of the policy stance that you have taken, and that is exactly what we have done. Hillary, public consultation, that's a very interesting one. Not something quite that the practice of introducing inflation, of revising the targets in South Africa had followed. And of course it would be useful if there is buy-in of the public on this. But if to arrive at a target is going to depend on the consultation process, then there wouldn't be a price stability anchor, because if public consultation process could go on and on, what is in no doubt is that South Africans would like to have lower inflation and higher standards of living. High inflation is not going to lead to higher standards of living. There are certain policies that you have consultation on, which are broad in nature. I am not sure setting of a target is one such. Just think what deficit we would have if the Minister of Finance had to go on a public consultation process to decide how much deficit we should have, and therefore how much tax rates should we have, and therefore how much we must spend on this and that, and therefore what level of debt we would want. We will never have a budget. So there are things that are consultative in a broad sense, but you cannot, I'm not sure it's useful to consult about a number. The consultation should be about, do you believe that South Africa should have a lower target of inflation? Actually, not even a lower target. Should South Africa be having lower inflation? As the developed world had come to teach us, their inflation is higher than their targets now. In the US, although inflation has declined, the Americans are still unhappy. Why are they unhappy? Because they once lived with inflation closer to zero, and they now suddenly realize inflation closer to zero is better than inflation at 2.6 or at 3.1. In spite of their inflation being lower than ours, they are very unhappy. I don't think South Africans are particularly happy with inflation at 5.2. And so, yes, we must talk about, we must put all of this information there. And the question that came, well, do we have any update? No, we don't. There is a technical process between the Treasury and the Reserve Bank. And once that process is concluded, we would take this thing through. In the previous things, the Minister of Finance will make the pronouncement as part of the budget or as part of the budget policy statement. These things get discussed in the portfolio committee and eventually goes through into Parliament. But that has been the nature of the consultation. Portfolio committee has got the consultation. That has been the nature of the consultation. Public consultation is useful. I am not sure that it is such a useful thing to try and do a consultation about a number. I've got no doubt if we have to have a public consultation of how much tax we must pay, the overwhelming majority will be zero. So I'm not sure that that is where we should be going. The two-pot system, It's also a very difficult one to calculate. Remember, there is a limit of how much you can draw. And to try and work this thing out, you could either make an assumption that every single pension fund member will draw this to their maximum. But the maximum that you draw also depends on how much you had put in the pot. And so there are so many moving parts. And what we ended up concluding is that there might be people who withdraw, but then even if they draw, would they use that money to repay their debt, or would they use it to consume? Of course, if they use it to pay their debt, it improves their spending power going forward over the medium term. But if they might decide they are going to use it to consume, it might have an impact on household consumption expenditure. But and I say there are so many moving parts. The people who are the higher income earners are unlikely to utilize the benefit. That benefit might be utilized by lower income earners. How far lower is that is a call that haven't been made. Are there any implications for financial stability? We have not picked up any that we think would have implications for financial stability. I think the limits that had been set would mean that the pension funds would continue to be sustainable. But even if there was to be an impact, it would have been an impact on more the defined benefit pension funds, which we do not have that many these days, than it would be on defined contribution. Because with the defined contribution, you will really be withdrawing your own money. You will be retiring with less. That's what it would be. Whereas with the defined benefit, the employer makes a particular commitment to pay you when you retire. Alistair, your question is challenging my knowledge of Avery. Because you see the statement, you say the statement is dovish. But even in my knowledge of Avery, I am not sure that doves can eat hawks. But that is not particularly useful. What is important is an assessment that we are giving, and we have given the indicators. When we said the risks are balanced, it doesn't mean we have taken a view that is tolerant for inflation. I'm told doves are apparently tolerant of inflation. We have not taken a view that is tolerant of inflation. We are very resolute that the job of bringing inflation to our target is not yet done. And so this is just our assessment of risks, and the risks might materialize in either direction. And based on data, we will then recalibrate policy as appropriate, depending on whether the risks have made the inflation outlook worse or better. And we hope they make it better, in which case you might have your wish. When that will be, I do not know. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. That concludes today's press conference. Kopano, I have answered all your questions. Oh yes, because it had nothing to do with this thing. We have not received any application. What would have happened is that if there was an agreement between the parties, to the extent that there are implications for our capital flow management framework, that they would submit an application which we would consider, and we would consider whether the transaction is a genuine arm's length transactions, how the transaction is financed, whether there is a recourse to South African funds, and whether there are funds that are coming in, and if there are funds coming in, how do we manage those inflows? If it results with funds going out, how do we manage those outflows? But we do not have a number. And given that the engagement got broken, there is no marriage, so we can't answer. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. That concludes the proceedings of today.